Hay una, ¿no?, que es donde Natan pasa la mayor parte del tiempo, hay como una convención de que tú fijas la conferencia 1 hora en punto, pero eso significa que empieza un cuarto de hora después, ¿no? Lo llama el cuarto de hora académico. Pero bueno, decía que en España no lo tenemos, pero que tenemos unos minutos de margen para que no nos lo tomamos tan en serio. Well, I'm switching to English, and thank you all for coming. And it's a pleasure to welcome back Natan Sznaider, who has been part of the projects with Paco that Paco Ferrandiz has directed over years of memory politics in Spain. And it's also not the first time that you present at the Seminario of Rastros y Rostros de la Violencia. So we're really honored to have you back, and we look forward to learning about your new work, Natan. And let me briefly introduce Professor Sznaider, who is emeritus professor in the Academic College of Tel Aviv-Yaffo in Israel, and he has been also professor at Columbia University, at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. And his main research areas have been memory cultures, cosmopolitism, antisemitism, political theory, the Shoah, and lately, I mean, he has always worked on Hannah Arendt, but lately he has produced a play together with Heinz Bude. Maybe you can also later tell us a little bit about this new avenue of interest, of research of yours, and how this is also a project that goes beyond the narrowly academic and has a broader impact. Among his books is Jewish Memory and the Cosmopolitan Order, Memory in Human Rights, together with Daniel Levy. I was privileged to work with him, and we published a book together, Memory and Forgetting in the Post-Holocaust Era, The Ethics of Never Again. And these are just a selection of several of his works. One of his most recent works is Memoires In Conflict, the vanishing points of the Holocaust and colonialism, which was published first in Germany and last year in French. And this is the topic that you will present today. And, yeah, we look forward to presentation and to engaging in a conversation about this issue. So thank you, Natan. And the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for inviting me. Yeah, good day. I'm really excited to be here again. I think it was, Maricha, when was it the first time? 10 years ago?
Maybe,
yeah, 10 years ago that I was invited to a conference here, and I think I gave a talk here at the same chair, like 10 years ago, 8 years ago, 7 years ago. So a lot have happened in the meantime, but I'm glad I'm back, and I will talk to you a little bit about a book I published in 2022, 3 years ago, called Vanishing Points of Memory, and I will explain a little bit later on what I mean with the concept of vanishing points and memory. It's a book published in German, came out in French, or comes out in French right now these days, and it's dealing with the interconnecting narratives of the Holocaust and colonialism, probably the two large moral narratives of the 20th century and the 21st century. When I said that I published that book in the fall of 2022, I published it a little bit a year. The book came out a year before October 7, 2023. I don't have to go into that, what it cost and the succeeding war. And these political narratives became very fast also kind of practical. They became practical politics. So my talk is about, if you like, the sociology of political knowledge. Why do we think politically about certain issues and how we deal with that? And it starts with the assumption that the way we think politically is not something automatic or predetermined or inevitable, but the way we think politically has actually sociological reasons. And I will talk about these sociological reasons, and it doesn't really matter which side you're on in a certain political conflict, that when you take a step back and look in a sociological way of ways people think about politics, then you can sort of like also take a step back from your own political views and look at them a bit from the outside. It's clear that in the wake of October 7, 2003, the world has changed dramatically for Israelis, for Jews inside Israel, for Jews outside Israel, for Palestinians, for Gaza, for everybody actually involved directly, but also involved indirectly. And it was about to begin a new area that actually started, I would think, in October 7, 23, and it is connected to the things I'm going to say. Like I said, in 2022, I had examined the perspectives of the debates on the comparability of the Holocaust and colonialism from a sociological perspective. Looking from Israel, this is the point of view I was looking at these debates, I had the impression back then in 2022 that these debates had reached an impasse, and I wanted to find a way out of this impasse. I wondered how to analyze the Holocaust and colonialism without relativizing the various particular experiences. As I understand it, the lines of remembrance of the Holocaust and colonialism run on parallel tracks, and yet they may meet in the perception of the readers. These are parallel descriptions from specific perspectives, and joint descriptions of the Holocaust and colonialism are therefore possible and can establish connections in consciousness that actually exist or not. For me, the vanishing point of memory, which is also the name of the book, is the point where reality and imagination meet. Almost 3 years later, meaning now, it seems that these two moral narratives, Shoah, Holocaust, and colonialism, are very often untranslatable. I also try to understand why this untranslatability takes hold. And it is, of course, also about the state of Israel as an implementation of Jewish political sovereignty. In the tension between Zionism as a secular national movement that strives for self-determination for the Jewish people, and also Judaism as a religious tradition and folk religion, not only Jews live in Israel, but outside Israel, the book then is clearly a book written from a Jewish point of view. Now, this is also, in more general terms, an argument about universalism and particularism. Israel has never seen itself as a universal project. Israel is the particular Jewish solution to a particular Jewish problem. This ambiguity inherent in modernity is rooted in the presence of the Jewish people inside of Israel and outside of it. Their visibility in the world permeates this ambiguity. Their invisibility tries to cover it up. For several years now, I've been observing more and more universalizing remembrance of the Holocaust in the progressive milieu inside and outside Germany, in Europe and other places, which under the guise of the Enlightenment places the murder of European Jews in a row with other crimes of mass and organized violence. Alex here and I have looked at the processes in the context of Argentinian, Spanish, and Ukrainian memory politics before the war in the Ukraine actually started. The book that we published, Memory and Forgetting in the Post-Holocaust Era, was published like 8 years ago. It's a long time ago. And it was, I think, the first time that two memory scholars, Alex and myself, were looking at memory from a more distant, more critical point of view, where we didn't take for granted that memory is a good thing. But we looked at it from a sociological perspective, what memory does to certain processes of transitional justice and others. And we also discovered in the book, and that's one of the theses, there are several theses in the book, that in the case of the Shoah, this can lead to disregard, even erasure of particular Jewish memory. So again, it's a study of the concepts of universalism and particularism. Why do we think, and why do some people think in a universal way, and why do people think in a particular way? Of course, I understand the temptation to think and feel universal, European, progressive, inclusive, if you like. I'm no stranger to thinking, but it's also, I think, a temptation trapped in its own idea of progress. I'm also influenced by that, otherwise I wouldn't be able to write about it at all. But I also know that stories of violence separate people from each other and do not connect them with each other. And this is a very important point that we have to take in mind. That's why I think that one of the conclusions to that is that in methodology, I've come to the result that telling stories is more important than maybe theoretical analysis of sort of like memory structures and all. Now, I'll give you an example. Specialists in genocide and anti-Semitism questioned the fact that memories of pogroms and the Shoah were reawakened after October 7th in Israel, saying that such analogies were unhistorical and did not serve a political solution. There was a letter published in the New York Review of Books, November 2023, where an open letter on the misuse of the Holocaust memories, where certain scholars, specialists in Holocaust memories, were publishing a letter and said, don't abuse the memory of the Holocaust in order to explain what happened on October 7th in Israel. Now, this is, of course, a point well taken. You shouldn't abuse memory. But what does that mean, to abuse memory? What does it mean to abuse memory when you think then, in the moment you say, I abuse memory, you assume at the same time that there's a correct use of memory. Otherwise, the concept of abuse of memory wouldn't make sense. Now, when you say, don't abuse memory, you actually need to say at the same time, what do you mean by using memory in the correct way? And of course, all this goes back to a long tradition in theory where people were talking about the instrumentalization of memory, that you were using memory as an instrument. Now, how else could you use memory if not as an instrument? I mean, the only alternative for the instrumentalization of memory is forgetting. Of course, there is also the assumption, if you're coming from a certain Frankfurt school of thought, that the opposite of instrumentalization is emancipation. So that the opposite of the instrumentalization of memory is the emancipation of memory. But again, you have to be very sure what you mean. What is emancipated memory? What is instrumentalized memory? And how do you distinguish these concepts scientifically from your own political views? If you have certain political views, you may say, this is instrumentalized. If you have different political views, you may say, this is instrumentalized. So there's a mix-up, basically, between scientific concepts and political concepts. Now, clearly, historical analogies may be unhistorical, maybe they serve or do not serve political solution. That may be the case. Comparing historical events, classifying them, finding notorious context is part of the tools of the trade of every person who sees himself or herself as an intellectual. But the emotional truths of the participants must remain, therefore, excluded to maintain the callous and cold objectivity. But at the same time, it is also an escape from reality, a reality that cannot be captured by any theory. If one insists that comparison has nothing to do with equating, it is precisely about equating then. And then the debates are coming to a dead end, and because all sides claim to be able to draw the lessons of a cruel history with the right attitude, and thus to walk on the right side of history. Now, what does it mean to walk on the right side of history? It's also used all the time in these debates. There are those, indeed there must be, who let themselves be driven by their moral ideas and come up with some ideas about what emancipation means, what anti-colonial struggle means, and put their signatures on appeals that condemn violence on all sides. This restores the apparent certainty, in my opinion, of grasping and understanding the world. And also, too often, the argument is simply based on a moral universalism of indiscriminate victims. You feel for everyone. And then you need to ask the question, is compassion therefore a universal idea that cancels out the concrete, although it must start from concrete pain to have any effect at all? Now, these are, in my opinion, sociological questions, and if you don't deal with them sociologically, you can decide to do that and say, I don't care about the sociology of things. I have strong political opinions, and I will go with these political opinions, and I don't care what their base actually is. And everyone who has strong political opinions should ask themselves, why do I think politically about these subjects the way I think about them and not differently? Am I born with these political opinions? Am I a more moral person than others? Why do I think politically about these subjects and not differently? Now, I would like to give you a story that is also the kernel of my book, where I try to illustrate this. It's a very German story, but it has, of course, implications outside of Germany. The story started in spring 2020, just at the same time when the coronavirus hit the world. There was a cultural festival in Germany called the Ruhr-Triennale, doesn't matter what it's called, and it's a major cultural festival in Germany. And they invited Achille Mbembe, one of the leading African theorists of post-colonialism, to give the opening lecture in August 2020. Nothing about this is unusual. Mbembe was a welcome guest, and he was no stranger to prizes in Germany. Some of his books are translated in all languages, and his most famous book, La critique de la raison nègre, was also translated into Spanish, as probably some of you know, Critica de la raison negra, and it was published in Spanish in 2019. Now, that was not the first prize that Mbembe was offered in Germany. He was offered a prize in Munich in 2015 called the Geschwister Scholl-Preis, the brother and sister Scholl Prize, 5 years before the spectacle of 2020 began. And this book prize, which carries the name of iconic people in Germany who resisted the Nazi regime, students in Munich, and this book prize is awarded for a book, and I quote the website of the prize, testifies to intellectual independence that is suitable for promoting civil liberty, moral and aesthetic courage, and to give important impulses to our current sense of responsibility, as it says on the website of the city of Munich and the prize. And you notice, it's a book, Intellectual Independence. That's a scientific concept, maybe. But promoting civil liberty, moral and aesthetic courage, that's already a political concept. And to give important impulses to our current sense of responsibility is also, of course, a political concept. And when you connect this to the icon Geschwister Scholl in Germany, then of course it is connected to German resistance against National Socialism. It is, as it says, about civil liberty, courage, and responsibility. In other words, German responsibility. And the prize was awarded to a Schill member for a completely different book in a completely different context. It was awarded for the German translation of Critique de la Raison Nègre, the Critica de la Raison Negra, from 2013. And Critique of Black Reason, as it was called in German in English translation, was to become a fundamental text for a new kind of studies, which was not very well known in Germany, namely Black studies, which is a transatlantic tradition which had yet to be institutionalized in Germany. It didn't really exist in that kind of form as it existed in Britain and in the United States. It's called Black Studies. And the Munich award speech on November 30th, 2015, almost 10 years ago, followed an intellectual tradition that is not completely unknown in Germany. Otherwise, this award ceremony would not have taken place at all, but it was framed in a new way, simply because the prize, which ties in with the resistance against National Socialism, now honored Black studies and post-colonial thinking. You see the switch. And a Schill member has stepped up to the task in his 2015 speech. He speaks of the universalization of the conditia nigra, as he called it, of a structural racism that began with the globalization of capitalism centuries ago. For him, the black slave becomes a universal category beyond black and white. He becomes a category of a superfluous man. In doing so, Member opened the door that would be, in doing so, Member opened the door that would be slammed shut on him a few years later. Now, what is going on there? What happened there? And this brings us to the rules and regulations and taboos regarding the German public sphere. His speech, as well as his writings, creates a counterfigure to the category of the universalized Jew, especially in the German public sphere, as we can find, for instance, in the thinking of Hannah Arendt. Now, Arendt, for instance, described the situation of the Jewish refugees in 1943, note the year, as follows. The refugees, displaced from one country to another, represented the vanguard of their peoples. For the first time, there is no longer a separate Jewish history. It is linked to the history of all nations. That is a quotation from an essay of hers from 1943 called We Refugees, where also she uses the we in We Refugees to construct sort of like a universal we. Now, which minorities are now considered a universal category is probably one of the big questions of our times. Is it the Jews, and does the attempt to destroy them? Or is it the blacks, the colonized, the non-whites, who, if you follow Member, are the center of world history? Now, the moment these questions leave the confines of academia and enter the public sphere, they become, of course, different questions. Is this a story about racism or anti-Semitism? And these are by no means marginal issues, but key questions that strike right at the heart of modern societies. Germany is no exception here. And these are not only scientific questions determined by historical comparisons and political analysis. There's a debate about how you understand the Holocaust, how you understand colonialism, and how you interpret them. And there are different understandings. Now, different people at different places understand the Holocaust as the culmination of the history of anti-Semitism. You can do that. The history of racism at its worst, and you can do that as well. Or as a crime against humanity. The difference between them are subtle but crucial. Anti-Semitism only happens to the Jews. Racism, thus broadened, can happen to anyone who is different or others. Crimes against humanity are broader still, and are even considered a crime against the human condition. Besides being arguments regarding historical scholarship, there are also questions of faith that are conducted and determined with passion and religious temperament. Is this a story about the binding of Isaac or about the crucifixion of Jesus? Again, is this a question of particularism or universalism? And different images come to play with these stories, how to read them and interpret them. The images of innocent Jews being transported as cattle on trains across Europe to be exterminated, and the images of innocent slaves being transported across the Atlantic on ships to be sold like cattle on the other side. It is therefore also no coincidence that the celebratory speech, eulogy for Mbembe at that 2015 prize ceremony was given by Paul Gilroy, who sort of like in his book, Black Atlantic, which was one of the first studies in the 1990s, sort of like putting post-colonial studies on the map, and also sort of like trying to give a global history of racism. And his first chapter, of course, is about the image of the ship, the slave ship, crossing the Atlantic. Gilroy also uses a concept of the black sociologist Du Bois, who talked about double consciousness as a part of how minorities deal with their identity. And Du Bois, on the other hand, sort of like picked up that concept of double consciousness while he was studying in Berlin. It took a class with the sociologist Georg Simmel and sort of like tried to incorporate Simmel's concept of the stranger with his own black sensibilities. You'll see sort of like a circular movement also from Simmel, a Jewish sociologist in Germany, to Du Bois, a black sociologist, to Gilroy, who from England then in his Black Atlantic started a post-colonial movement, to Achille Mbembe, who sort of like gave then this rights, a kind of black Jewish Atlantic, if you want, this movement. But let's get back to our story from 2020. When it was published that Achille Mbembe was sort of like giving the opening speech at the festival I was talking about, serious accusations against him were put into the public sphere. He was accused of relativizing the Holocaust, to equate the state of Israel with South Africa's apartheid system, and from here the path was open to accuse him of being anti-Semite, which in Germany is a very serious accusation, and that the German state should not use taxpayers' money to support anti-Semitism. So went the argument. Mbembe was accused of questioning Israel's right to exist, which is considered as you know, an integral part of German official politics. What is called the reason of state of Germany is Israel's security. Now this opened what is called in German a feuilleton war, a war between different articles published in newspapers and also it was clear, if you publish an article at a certain newspaper, it has a certain opinion. If you publish an article, another opinion, you might have the same situation in Spain, where you will know if it's published in El País, it has a certain political bent. If it's published in another paper, it has another political bent. The same basically happened in Germany too. So you pick up the newspaper you feel most comfortable with, you read a political opinion piece you feel most comfortable with, and you're reinforced in your opinion what to think about the subject. If you read another newspaper which is against your own political views, you might get a little bit thrown off balance. Social media got into the game as well, and in the air was the accusation of Achille, if Achille Mbembe is indeed an anti-Semite, or is he part of a large-scale left-wing campaign against Israel, and whether post-colonialism is a serious academic field of studies which promotes maybe certain sentiments or resentiments. Now, the whole business was saved by Corona, and the festival was cancelled, and in August 20, and but the debates weren't cancelled at all. Mbembe himself was outraged by all these accusations and accused his opponents, of course, of being racist. So you had this harsh debate. Mutual accusations of anti-Semitism and McCarthyism were part of a rather hysterical war of newspaper articles, and topics included freedom of expression, while others insisted on the difference between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. Basically, it was a prelude to the situation, the political situation we have today. So what is going on here? There's more to it than an interesting story about the framing of political struggles in the public sphere. When I looked at this and started analyzing it myself, I took as my point of departure the sociology of knowledge, which emerged in Germany during the Weimar era. And this is, of course, no coincidence. Not unlike today, that kind of new field which developed in Germany in the 1920s tackled the questions of how we find truth in a world of differing interests, experiences, and worldviews. Like today, back then was an atmosphere of universal distrust. Parties and people all claimed that they could see through the arguments of the others as nothing else but ideology. I speak the truth, you speak ideology. That was basically the argument in the 20s, and it has become also the argument today. And there's no persuasion possible, no negotiations possible between these different worldviews. So one of the starting points of trying to think about this for me was Max Weber, who hoped to find an ideal of social science that could transcend the sort of political intellectual warfare, that could separate the search for stable truth in the classroom from the fight for dominance in the political arena. And for him, the distinction between the classroom and the political arena were very clear. And in 1917, just before World War I ended, he gave a speech before students in Munich, a speech which had become then iconic, Science as Vocation, Wissenschaft as Beruf, in which he talked about what it means to be a teacher and researcher as opposed to be a politician. According to Weber, both scientists and politicians live in two different worlds and use words differently. The words of politicians are swords. They use words as weapons, whereas researchers, so Weber, use words as plowshares to loosen the soil of contemplative thought. And just like Max Weber, also Karl Mannheim grappled with similar existential anxieties as Weber. He had a very different biographical trajectory as Weber's, a bourgeois Hungarian liberal Jew, escaping from the Algerian counter-revolution to Germany, came to Heidelberg, confronted Max Weber's ghost in the person of his brother Alfred, with whom he studied. Mannheim was convinced that political combat would swamp the intellectual search for truth. Both did not believe that sociology could fulfill Isaiah's vision of, and I quote Isaiah as was quoted by Mannheim himself, "He shall judge between the nations and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." They didn't believe in that vision, but if not, what then? And Mannheim basically finished his book, Ideology and Utopia, when he talked about the role of intellectuals. What should they do? And he said, very simple, they should be part of watchmen in what otherwise would be a pitch black night. That's the way Mannheim understood the role of intellectual. So clearly, Mannheim was accused to be a bourgeois intellectual by the left. Horkheimer, for instance, wrote a review of his book with the pointing sentence, "Mannheim really didn't get Karl Marx right." That was enough to be sort of like a dismissing review of his thoughts. And the conservatives and the right sort of like dismissed Mannheim as a typical Jewish sociologist who relativizes everything and doesn't really know the deepness of truth. So Mannheim was in the middle between sort of like the right and the left, which I think is a good place to be. So let's try to be such watchmen. The grand moral narratives of cruelty came upon us with profound political ramifications. The Western narrative is reminiscent of the crimes of totalitarianism, such as the Holocaust and the Gulag. Beyond the Atlantic world, these memories hardly play a role. The focus here is on the atrocities of the West against the world outside the West. Not the Holocaust, but colonialism and imperialism are the semantic markers. These two moral narratives are not always easy to separate. They are often linked in both historiography and political analysis. And of course, they overlap in the Middle East conflict, because one is a direction from west to east, if you like, and one is a direction from north to south. And the meeting point might be exactly where the Middle East is. And that's also why this is one of the points where these two narratives actually clash. Both claim to be on the right side of history, which begs the question how to be on the right side of history. Both use the tools of sociology of knowledge to analyze what the right side of history means at the same time. So what is the right side of history? If you ask many honest people, and I don't mean this ironically at all, then the right side of history is a universal attitude, which of course also takes the side of the weak and oppressed. But here too the direction is not always clear. Does being oppressed mean that you have an epistemological vantage point that others do not have? Is it really true that the powerless speak truth only because they are powerless and oppressed? Is that not, in a way, just the opposite or mirror image of the view that theoreticians like Foucault and others have tried to teach us, that power is connected to knowledge? So if you reverse it and says that the truth is then connected to lack of power, why is that so? Says who? Why is that almost taken as like an automatic point of beginning or assumption. And this is exactly, I think, what aggravates the fierceness of the debates. Both sides claim to draw the lessons of a cruel history with their attitudes and the walk on the right side. But the right side of the story has taken different paths. For the Western part of the world, the point of reference for new moral absolutism after 1945 is clearly the Holocaust. Even for those for whom the right side of history was elsewhere, see the Holocaust as a historical foil and background against which atrocities and atrocities near and far are read, even if they took place, not taking place elsewhere. A wide variety of worldviews are based on it, which then lead to different, sometimes contrary conclusions. And in many cases, it's about never again, which is also what Alex and I have written in our book about the ethics of never again. And many declarations after 1945 are based on this never again, the non-repetition of the catastrophe. One example, whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and believe in freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. This is written at the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's truth written in stone. Disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts. They don't say which barbarous acts, but you can sort of like imagine then when this text was put into use in 45 that it was clear, in 48 or after 45, it was clear what was meant by barbarous acts. Also completely assumed that they have outraged the conscience of mankind. Says who? And the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. It's an utopia, a universal utopia which we aspire to. But it is framed as the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as truth, as a claim for truth, which of course we believe in it or we don't believe in it. It's a question of faith, not a question of scientific truth. So, never again, says here the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Here under the umbrella of human rights, the never again becomes the political indictment of all genocide, colonialism, apartheid, dictatorship. Never again tyranny from people over people is probably one of the most famous incantations that exist today. But there's also an alternative never again. The catastrophe which recently befell the Jewish people, the massacre of millions of Jews in Europe, was another clear demonstration of the urgency of solving the problem of its homelessness by re-establishing in Era.The, the Jewish state, which would open the gates of the homeland wide to every Jew and confer upon the Jewish people the status of a fully privileged member of the Committee of Nations. Same year, 1948. Another never again. And also, basically, sentences which claim to be true, sort of like a clear demonstration of urgency of solving the problem of its homelessness by re-establishing a state.
You did mention this is the declaration.
Never again says the Israeli Declaration of Independence. And above all, it says, never again we. So again, you have the distinction between universalism and particularism. Here, the Holocaust is a historic crime against the Jews. This never again is about group fates, human fates, but also about individual fates, never again victims. The core has shifted from the general never again to never be a victim again. With this declaration, the Israeli state declares itself to be a safe haven for the Jews, for whom the fate of sacrifice should never happen again. This is an ideologically very different never again. as I said, the state of Israel thus becomes a particular solution to a particular problem. And this never again is therefore opposed to universalization, almost as a matter of principle. And I think in that these two declarations, you see the parting ways, sort of like about the principle of universal human rights as against the principle of national sovereignty on the other hand. And the never again is realized in a concrete action, the creation of a safe place that protects against being a victim, even when all other places become inaccessible. But the principle of human rights stands in the way of particularization. If human rights are not equally valid for all people, then they are not human rights. We are facing competing forms of never again. And on the other hand, never again mobilized, never again moralizes, never again is always right. Because who wants tyranny, genocide, colonialism, fascism, and the Holocaust again? So that was the framework, actually, of the debate in the summer of 2020. It was an attempt to delegitimize one's opponent's view of claiming they are a mask for the interest and prejudices. I speak truth, you speak ideology, was basically the mutual argument. So what I try to do in the book, I try to understand the different ways of thinking, how they work, where they come from, how they develop, and then the question of whatever the different ways of thinking can be brought into conversation. These questions are existential. How should the past be understood? Like a future that draws its lessons from the past. And since it's also about a special German guilt and the collective responsibility based on it, the apparent universal guidelines are, of course, also very quickly to be understood in a particular way. So this is the arena where the players fight each other. And there are spectators who very often point the finger up or down. With my Vanishing Points book, I wanted to engage my readers with the geometric metaphor of vanishing points. The geometrical definition of vanishing point is a vanishing point is a point on the image plane of a perspective rendering where two-dimensional perspectives, projections of mutually parallel lines in a three-dimensional space appear to converge. That if you look up Wikipedia, vanishing points in geometry, this is what it says, and it gives you the pictures also where you can see that you have two parallel lines sort of like meeting somewhere on the horizon. Now, what does vanishing points, the geometry of vanishing points mean in terms of memory studies? It's the point when you come to Holocaust and colonialism, they run parallel, seem to meet at some point for the observer. It's the point where reality, imagination converge. But more often than not, they don't. They are all descriptions from a certain perspective. Thus, causalities between colonialism and the Holocaust can be declared and stated, but they're certainly not proven, as there's now a certain new literature says that Holocaust is part of what happened before in German history, and German colonial history was leading to the Holocaust. You can say that, but you cannot prove that. That one happened in time before the other doesn't mean they're causally connected. You know, that's statistics 101, as we first-year students in sociology remembered. But what happened is that all actors in the debate had to argue universally to convince their audience. But if you take a closer look at the argumentation of the 2 points of view, they both sides try to explain particulars universally. On the one hand, the enlightened elite believes in a global human rights discourse born of the shock of the Holocaust. From the Holocaust, crimes against humanity are then understood and emphasized, which universalized a particular crime. The concept of genocide is crucial here. In this way, truths taken for granted are called into question, and specifically, German taboos are breaking. So that's the framework of the book. What is the sociology of political thinking? Your own way of political thinking, how do you explain it? And I think that we often think that the way we think politically is inevitable. I don't think so. My own method in the book was to look at thinkers who disagree with me, because I came to these questions with a certain political point of view, which was my own. But what happens when I confront that political opinion of my own with thinkers who disagree with me? And I kind of pay them a visit. So I was looking at voices like Arendt, which sometimes I agree, sometimes I not. Albert Memmi, whom I agree a lot. Claude Lanzmann, the same, sometimes agree, sometimes not. Frantz Fanon, sometimes agree, not more than yes. Émile Césaire, Edward Said, Du Bois, and how they describe the world as Jews, Arabs, French, or blacks, what they have in common, but also what separates them. This is not about contradictions, but about tensions in one's own fate and biography, and how sociological understanding of these positions can be developed from this. Thus, for instance, one good example is the friendship between Frantz Fanon and Claude Lanzmann. Frantz Fanon, who is now considered to be one of the major thinkers of anti-colonial thought and practice, and Claude Lanzmann, who's considered with his monumental movie Shoah as one of those who defend the particularity of the Holocaust experience. Both men met in 1960, felt sort of like an intellectual attraction to each other, and became friends for a very short time, because Fanon was then dying of his disease. But what they had in common was they were both French, they were both speaking French, thinking in French, but were opponents of French Enlightenment and universalism. One from a black colonial perspective, the other from a Jewish perspective. But they saw enough common ground to have sort of like an intellectual connectedness. I started the book with Mannheim's sociology of knowledge, but also with Kafka, the debates about the Dreyfus affair with Hannah Arendt, who has a special significance in this discussion. In this respect, I thought that post-colonial discourse could learn a lot from Jewish thinking if it wanted to. And I don't think that is not only due to a lack of wanting. I think there's only a bit of supersession belief at play here, replacement theology. And in this theology, the new post-colonial thinking does not have any room for any kinds of other minorities. So the non-dialogue is not coincidental. The pasts are different, they divide us, they don't bring us into dialogue. And I also don't want to be under the illusion that psychological insights into trauma and how they can be overcome can simply be transported into politics. In our joint book, Alex and I have written, I think, a very nice critique of the concept of trauma and how it is transported into politics and how it's basically quite useless there, even though it's very much used. This happens a lot in these attempts to think about the experiences of violence together. I would rather argue for a concept called enlarged thought, a term that Hannah Arendt borrowed from Kant and understood in such a way that one should not give up one's own position, but nevertheless understand other attitudes in the context of their particularity without making one's point of view absolute. You send your mind out to visit others and then return home. Thus, Jews can, for instance, be Orientalist and orientalizing at the same time, minority and majority at the same time, and this happens to others as well. Like I said, these are stories that could facilitate a productive conversation between post-colonialism and Jewish experiences. The Jewish experiences of the 19th and 20th centuries, minority politics, problems of assimilation, recognition, antisemitism, structures of exclusion and inclusion, could also be post-colonialist experiences. And again, this is not only a scholarly enterprise, but a political as well. Let me finish with Max Weber's final point in his Science as Vocation speech. We shall set to work and meet the demands of the day in human relations as well as in our vocation. This, however, is plain and simple when each finds and obeys the demon who holds the fibers of his very life. If this sounded in Weber like a sermon, it was exactly intended as such. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natan, for an inspiring talk, as always. So we open it up to comments or questions.
I was wondering if maybe the absence of a Jewish presence in the post-colonial studies might not be also due to the fact that both Jewish studies and post-colonial studies share a blind spot, and it's non-European Jews, Middle Eastern Jews, North African Jews, which for people like Fanon, they put their entire theory on the spot. Actually, Fanon even claimed that Algerian Jews were the European element in Algeria, which doesn't make any possible sense. But the same in the case of Syrian Jews, of Iraqi Jews, these are Middle Eastern and North African Jews that make the claims of a lot of the post-colonial authors questionable to the very least, especially when it comes to concept of indigeneity. But also, it puts them on the spot when, in terms of their assumption that Jews are white and the only thing that makes them not white is antisemitism. Meaning the Jew becomes another when he's recognized as such. That's on the one hand, but also within the context of Jewish studies. And there is also a very European-centered experience that mediates the ideas of otherness, in relation to whom Jews are another, but also the very debates about Jewish sovereignty. This is still, they're rooted still in a European experience of diaspora, and very rarely is the North African and the Middle Eastern experience brought into the conversation. So I was wondering what you think about this blind spot and the potential of this to facilitate a conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Rico. What's your name?
Andy.
First of all, you're right. I mean, that's the first thing to say. And it's interesting that when you apply to an American college today, there's this rubric that is very strange for people outside of America, where you sort of like put your ethnicity in, sort of like make a cross. And Jewish does not appear anymore. So there's African American, there's Latino American, there's Asian American, there's Native American, there's all that. And then there's Caucasian, which is white. And Jews have to cross the rubric of white because there's no category of Jewish American anymore in the college application in America. Which means that in many ways, the center where Jewish studies has been put forward, the United States and the American Academy, Jews have become white.
Yeah.
clearly, which was also their aspiration, which was also their aspiration. Now, you're also right, because there's one post-colonial thinker which has, I have written a whole chapter on him in the middle of my book, which is not considered a post-colonial thinker in the books on post-colonialism, which is Albert Memmi, which does exactly what you're sort of like demanding and asking for.
Yeah.
And Memmi, I don't know if it's translated into Spanish. Yes, he is.
Not everything, but yeah.
Memmi is a very fascinating person, because he says, I'm Jewish, I'm Arab, I'm French. And I'm all three of them, and I'm none of them. And he has written wonderful books about his Jewish identity, about his Arab identity, and about what it means to be French at the same time. And he has also written a book about anti-colonialism. And he lived to be 100, almost, and died exactly when I was writing the book, sort of like all of a sudden. It was at 22. And Memmi, when you look at textbooks on post-colonialism, he doesn't appear. He's just left out. He's written out on the history of post-colonialism, maybe because he was also had Zionist inclinations, sort of like he was not against Israel, which is a no-no in post-colonial circles. But he was trying to do exactly that. He was trying to sort of like bring back the Arab Jew sort of like into the way of post-colonial thinking. So you're right, the absence of Oriental or Mizrahi Jews in Jewish studies, and is also connected to the absence of those Jews in post-colonial studies, because they really don't fit. There was in Israel, like 10, 15 years ago, a small movement of sort of, like, you probably, Ela Shochat and all these,
They're in the States.
and she's in the States, but there were also those in Israel who sort of like tried to connect post-colonialism to post-Zionism and all that, but it was so tiny, sort of like it didn't really reach a larger public. But I think it's important to push Memmi back into the discourse and see him sort of like as a connecting intellectual figure of these two streams. But you're absolutely right.
Thank you for that. That was inspiring. When I put sort of a follow-up question is, and of course, at some level, there's a reductionism in a kind of post-colonialism history you brought into the equation. Because if one was to, as you say, stress the sociology rather than the politics of how you read this kind of historical matrices. Post-colonialism is really post-colonialisms, and the South Asian experience is very different from the African, or even the North African experience, or the history of post-colonialism in North Africa, which is very different from the Latin American context. And of course, more recently, those post-colonialisms in the plural have sort of disassembled into decolonialism, which is more sort of embedded in the Latin American context, with specific roots to liberation theology and the role of the liberation theology movements. The South Asian context, where post-colonialism is also more in conversation with subaltern studies, or even sort of in some northern Asian context where post-colonialism is also flirting with post-socialism. So, this is just sort of, not a question, just more of a comment of what does it mean actually to pluralize the historical context of that particular conversation between post-colonialism and the Holocaust experience, when the post-colonial is actually sort of pluralized, multiplied, regionalized, etc.
Yeah.
That's a good point too. I think also what would help us here again is like focus on what happened in American academia in that context, and when did sort of like a certain post-colonial view become focused on the question of Palestine. And here, of course, the major figure is Edward Said, who was sort of like moved post-colonial thinking into a certain direction. And it happened after you have this move from anti-colonialism to post-colonialism, which is a French move, sort of like from Fanon, Césaire, and other thinkers. Now, these countries have reached independence. And what do you do then? And some of these countries who have reached independence were not really pleasant. So what do you do then with the kind of liberation thought? Especially the question of Algiers were very important here. So you had Edward Said at Columbia University, which is now again the focus of, as you probably have noticed, at the focus of many of these debates that we have today. But at Columbia University, Edward Said was moving post-colonialism, connecting it to Foucaultian theory, written that very famous book, Orientalism, which focused sort of like on certain points of post-colonialism. But 1 year later, when Orientalism came out in 1977 in English, and 1 year later in 1978, he sort of like, when Orientalism was the theory, the question of Palestine was the practice. And 1 year later, he had this book, The Question of Palestine, where he sort of like applied all his thinking that he developed in Orientalism, which is the minority point of view. He took from Foucault the epistemological vantage point of the oppressed, and so forth. And also, he was sort of like in dialogue with that what we talked before, that Jews have become white in America, which means that Israeli Jews are not part of like an emancipatory movement anymore, but are part of the movement of the white oppressors. And he has moved that particular way of post-colonial thinking into that direction, completely ignoring, I think, these elements of post-colonialism that you mentioned in Latin American context and all the contexts. But again, it's like almost an American academic structure that we have to look at in order to understand these processes.
I wanted to ask you, Natan, about actually two things. One is this: having lived 10 years in the U.S. and seen how established, how rooted the concept of settler colonialism in the own process of American coming to terms with its past, no? And Patrick Wolf, and a framework that has really a big impact, not just in academic circles, but also in activist circles. So your thoughts on differences between the settler colonial paradigm with previous ones, and which is also connected, and the fact that it's also very much connected to Palestine as a sort of a paradigm of settler colonialism. Mm-hmm. And then it's interesting to see, and I don't know if what can be said about this. The Islamist movement, and Hamas in particular, has shifted actually in its charter from 1988, which used sort of protocols of the Elders of Zion, language and direct allusions to European anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories, towards I think it's the 2018 charter, where they actually incorporate a language, the post-colonial language. Mm-hmm. And some scholars have alluded to that, saying trying to resonate, to distance themselves from those Nazi resonances and to connect more with the spirit of the time, and also particularly in the West. So yeah, these two things. I'm curious to know your thoughts about it.
Yeah. There's a very important journal that is actually cutting through these things, because it's a political journal and a scientific journal. It's a journal published by Sage, which means that it should be an academic journal. Otherwise, why would it be published by Sage? But if you read the articles, they're political pamphlets. So, and the journal is called Settler Colonial Studies. So here you have a very good example, sort of like how a certain political agenda has completely penetrated sort of like the academic studies in that journal, Settler Colonial Studies. Now, I have looked at that journal over the years, and it's clear, I mean, the beginning of the settler colonial paradigm is trying to explain, had nothing to do with Palestine at all. It had to do with Australia, Canada, and the United States. So, and people who were working in that settler colonial paradigm, sort of like were sort of like trying to critique sort of like the history of the United States, the history of Canada, the history of Australia, as settler colonial studies in order to distinguish from like classical imperialism studies, because this is also the shift, the semantic shift from imperialism to colonialism. Sort of like we don't live in a world of imperialism anymore, we live in a world of colonialism. This has nothing to do with exploiting the resource, it has to do with settling and disappropriating the native population, and not sort of like exploiting them for a motherland, because in settler colonialism there is no motherland anymore. The motherland does not really pay attention. So the first issues of settler colonialism were kind of focused on, especially on Australia. Most articles were on Australia. This is where, you know, Dirk Moses made his the beginning of his academic career with the analysis sort of like of Australia settler colonialism. And then issue number 3, 4, you could see sort of like, why only Australia, Canada, and the United States? Let's also look at the Middle East. And here, the person you mentioned, Patrick Wolf, played a very important role in order to analyze sort of like Zionism as a settler colonial movement. And then you had sort of like almost in every issue, you had an article about the settler colonialism of the Zionist movement. And it became sort of like ingrained in the progressive view, sort of like in a certain anti-Zionist sort of like thinking that what was going on there was basically a settler colonial movement. Now, this is also connected, of course, and what you said about the Charter of Hamas and all that. This is also connected to the concept of apartheid, because this is the same time that the concept of apartheid was also being introduced into the settler colonial language. And you had then people using the concept of apartheid to try to explain the Middle East conflict, which is, of course, apartheid is a South African concept, being universalized, if you like, to explain other cases, and also it evokes, of course, questions of boycott, cultural and economic, academic boycott, which is connected to South Africa. If it worked for South Africa, why can't it work for the Middle East as well. And the movement of boycotting Israel, the BDS movement, boycott, divest, sanctions, the BDS movement, of course then we're using the concept of apartheid in their sort of like in their writings in order to justify then. And apartheid is a good concept where you can see the use and misuse of political concepts in political struggles. And exactly that then, sort of like also the people who were sort of like rewriting the charters of Hamas, sort of like we're also thinking that we cannot really use anymore classic European anti-Semitic images like the protocols of the Sages of Zion. This does not really work with the progressive milieu anymore. And we have to connect with people on their own level, and settler colonialism and apartheid are exactly the concepts that we can sort of like connect our struggle theoretically.
Any more questions or comments? Well, then we will leave it here. We thank you very much, Natan, for coming, for making us think, and for, as always, I'm always appreciative of all the learning that I was able to do with your reading, and now with your also with your lectures. I want to thank Clara also for doing a wonderful poster for this lecture. Clara Fuentes, who's also recording now. This will be put on the YouTube channel of the project. And well, thank you all for coming. And yeah, we'll be in touch with our next events. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.